They always arrive within 72 hours. 3 knocks on the door. Men in perfect black suits who know your name before you speak. They carry no identification, yet somehow they know exactly what you saw in the sky that night, and they're here to make sure you never speak of it again. These men claim to represent government agencies that don't exist. They know intimate details about your life, your family, your job, your fears. They speak in precise, measured sentences that sound like they learned English from a manual. And when they leave, witnesses report the same thing, the overwhelming feeling that they weren't entirely human. Tonight, I'm sharing 11 encounters with these mysterious figures that have never been documented publicly, cases so disturbing that even government files remain classified decades later. These aren't the Hollywood versions you've seen on screen. These are raw testimonies from ordinary people whose lives were forever changed by 3 knocks on their door. Welcome to Arcade Recaps. I'm your host, and these are the suppressed encounters that intelligence agencies desperately want to keep buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight. And if you're settling in for sleep tonight, you might want to double check your door locks first. Now dim the lights and prepare for accounts that prove the most terrifying truth isn't what's watching us from the skies, it's what walks among us, wearing human faces, making sure certain secrets never see daylight. These are the men in black cases that show contact isn't just real, it's being actively covered up. The Morrison Ranch Visitation, 1967, Colorado Springs. The morning of September 15th started like any other for cattle rancher Dale Morrison. Coffee at dawn, checking the herd, mending fences under the endless Colorado sky. But by evening, his quiet life would be shattered by visitors who knew far too much about what he'd seen 3 nights earlier. It had been Tuesday when Dale first spotted the lights. 3 brilliant orbs hovering silently above his pasture, casting an eerie glow over his cattle. The animals stood motionless, as if frozen in time. For nearly 20 minutes, Dale watched from his porch as the lights performed impossible maneuvers, stopping and starting with mechanical precision before vanishing into the star-filled sky. He'd told no one, not his wife, not his neighbors, not even the sheriff when he'd considered calling. It was his secret, his burden to carry. But apparently, it wasn't as secret as he'd believed. The knock came at exactly 7:30. Dale knew the time precisely because he'd been watching the evening news, checking his watch, wondering if the strange lights might return. His wife Martha was visiting her sister in Denver, leaving him alone on the isolated ranch. Through the window, he could see a black sedan parked in his driveway. Not a car he recognized from town, and certainly not one built for Colorado's rough country roads. Too clean, too perfect, like it had just rolled off a showroom floor despite the dusty gravel drive. 2 men stood at his door. Both wore identical black suits that seemed untouched by the September wind. White shirts, thin black ties, and dark sunglasses despite the approaching sunset. They stood perfectly still, hands at their sides, waiting with an unnatural patience that made Dale's skin crawl. "Mr. Morrison," the first man said when Dale opened the door. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. "We need to discuss Tuesday evening." Dale's blood ran cold. He hadn't mentioned Tuesday to anyone, not a soul. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Dale managed, gripping the door frame. "We represent certain government interests," the second man replied, his voice identical to his companion's. "May we come in?" Everything in Dale's mind screamed to slam the door, to call for help, to run. But something about these men paralyzed him. They radiated an authority that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to some primitive part of his brain that recognized predators. "I suppose," Dale heard himself say, stepping aside. The men entered his home with measured steps, their movements perfectly synchronized. They didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the family photos on the walls or the comfortable clutter of ranch life. Their attention remained fixed solely on Dale, as if nothing else in the world existed. "Please sit," the first man instructed, though it was Dale's own living room. They arranged themselves on his couch, sitting with perfect posture, hands folded identically in their laps. Up close, Dale noticed details that made his stomach turn. Their skin was pale, almost grey, and seemed to have an odd texture, like it didn't quite fit properly. When they blinked, which they did in perfect unison, their eyelids moved too slowly. Tuesday evening, approximately 9:15, the second man began. You observed 3 aerial phenomena above your eastern pasture. It wasn't a question. They knew. The objects remained stationary for 18 minutes and 37 seconds before departing in a northwest trajectory, the first man continued. You considered contacting local authorities but decided against it. Dale's mouth went dry. The precise timing, the exact direction, details he hadn't even consciously noted himself. How could they possibly know? "What do you want?" he whispered. The men exchanged a glance, their heads turning in perfect synchronization. When they looked back at Dale, something had changed in their demeanor. The already thin veneer of humanity seemed to slip further. "Mr. Morrison," the first man said, leaning forward slightly, "you will not discuss Tuesday's events with anyone. You will not file reports. You will not seek explanations. And if I do," the second man smiled, an expression so cold and artificial that Dale immediately wished he hadn't asked. "Mr. Morrison, you have a beautiful ranch, peaceful, isolated. Your wife Martha enjoys her weekly visits to Denver, doesn't she? Such predictable routes she takes." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Dale's hands began to shake. "We know you understand," the first man said, standing with mechanical precision. His companion rose simultaneously, their movements a mirror image of each other. They moved toward the door, but the first man paused, turning back with that same unnatural smile. "Oh, and Mr. Morrison, the lights you saw Tuesday, they were never here. Nothing happened on your ranch. Nothing at all." Dale watched from his window as they climbed into their sedan. The car started without sound, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness as it glided down his driveway. But what haunted him most was what he noticed in those final moments. The license plate was completely blank, just smooth black metal reflecting his porch light. For 3 weeks, Dale kept silent. He went about his daily routine, tended his cattle, spoke to neighbors about weather and grain prices. But the encounter had changed something fundamental inside him. He jumped at unexpected sounds, checked his locks multiple times each night, and found himself constantly scanning the horizon for black sedans. The breaking point came when Martha returned from Denver with news that chilled him to the bone. Her sister had mentioned seeing a strange black car parked at the end of Dale's driveway several times during her absence. A car that would disappear whenever someone approached. They'd been watching, waiting, making sure he kept his word. That night, Dale made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He drove to the county sheriff's office and told the whole story. Every detail, from the hovering lights to the mysterious visitors who knew impossible things. Sheriff Tom Bradley listened with growing concern. He'd known Dale Morrison for 15 years. The man was steady, reliable, not given to flights of fancy or tall tales. But the story he told defied everything Bradley thought he knew about the world. "Dale," Bradley said carefully, "I believe you saw something. But men in black suits who know things they shouldn't know? That sounds like something out of a spy movie. Then explain the car, Tom. Explain how they knew exactly what I saw, exactly when I saw it. Explain how they knew Martha's schedule." Bradley couldn't explain any of it, but he promised to look into it, to make some calls, to see if any federal agencies had been operating in the area. The next morning, Sheriff Bradley's phone rang at 5:30. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. "Sheriff Bradley, this is Agent Collins with the Department of Defense. We understand you've received a report regarding certain activities in your jurisdiction. We're handling this matter now. Please transfer all related materials to our office immediately." What materials? I haven't even filed a report yet. Nevertheless, Sheriff, this matter is now under federal jurisdiction. Mr. Morrison's claims are the result of a misunderstanding. There was no UFO sighting. There were no visitors. We trust you understand the importance of maintaining public order. The line went dead. Bradley stared at the phone, his mind reeling. He'd mentioned Dale's visit to no one. His deputy hadn't arrived yet. The office had been empty except for him. Yet somehow, someone knew exactly what had happened, exactly what had been discussed. That afternoon, Bradley drove to the Morrison ranch. He found Dale in his barn, repairing tack with shaking hands. The man looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "They called you, didn't they?" Dale said without looking up. "How did you know?" "Because they call everyone, Tom. Because they know everything. Because this is bigger than either of us can handle." Dale set down his tools and looked directly at the sheriff. "I'm leaving, Tom. Selling the ranch, moving somewhere far from here. Martha doesn't know yet, but I can't stay. They made it clear what would happen if I talked, and I've already said too much." "Dale, you can't let them intimidate you. This is America. We have rights." Dale laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Rights? Tom, those things weren't human. I don't know what they were, but they weren't men. They knew things no government agent could know. They moved like machines, talked like recordings, and their eyes." Dale shuddered. Their eyes were completely black, not brown, not dark blue, black as midnight. Within a month, the Morrison Ranch was sold. Dale and Martha moved to Oregon, where they bought a small house near the coast. Dale never spoke of UFOs again, never looked up at the night sky with anything but fear. Sheriff Bradley tried to forget the whole incident, but found himself unable to let it go. He began researching, making quiet inquiries, reaching out to other law enforcement officers who might have encountered similar situations. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. Stories from across the country, dozens of them, all following the same pattern. UFO sightings, followed by visits from mysterious men in black suits who knew impossible things and made threats that weren't quite threats, but were somehow more terrifying than any direct intimidation. And in every case, the witnesses either fell silent or disappeared entirely. The Riverside Airport Confrontation, 1974, California. Air traffic controller Janet Walsh had been working the graveyard shift at Riverside Municipal Airport for 3 years when she witnessed something that would forever change her understanding of who really controls American airspace. It was a quiet Thursday night in October, the kind of shift where the biggest excitement usually came from routing a lost Cessna or dealing with a minor equipment malfunction. But at 2:17 a.m., Janet's radar screen lit up with something that shouldn't have been there. A solid return moving at impossible speeds, executing turns that would have torn apart any known aircraft. She called it in to March Air Force Base, following standard protocol for unidentified aircraft in controlled airspace. "March Tower, this is Riverside Municipal. I have an unidentified target moving at high speed through Sector 7. No transponder, no flight plan, no radio contact." The response came back immediately. "Riverside, we show nothing on radar. Please confirm your equipment is functioning normally." Janet checked her systems twice. Everything was working perfectly. The target was still there, still moving in ways that defied physics. "March Tower, my equipment is functioning normally. I have a solid target, altitude approximately 15,000 feet, speed varying between stationary and approximately 3,000 miles per hour. Riverside Municipal, you are ordered to disregard the target. Do not file a report. Do not log the contact. Consider this direct military instruction." Janet stared at her radio in disbelief. In 3 years of air traffic control, she'd never received such an order. Controllers were required to log all contacts, all communications, all unusual events. It was federal law, but the target on her screen was performing maneuvers that no earthly aircraft could execute. Sharp 90-degree turns without deceleration, vertical climbs that seemed to ignore gravity, sudden stops that should have resulted in catastrophic structural failure. For 47 minutes, Janet tracked the object as it moved through her airspace with deliberate precision. It seemed to be surveying, following specific flight patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random movement. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it accelerated straight up and vanished from her screen. Janet sat in her darkened control room, staring at the blank radar scope, her hands trembling as she tried to process what she'd witnessed. Despite the military's instructions, she wrote a detailed account in her personal logbook. Time, altitude, speed, direction changes, duration. Everything a trained professional should record. She never made it home that morning. As Janet walked to her car in the employee parking lot, two men approached from the shadows near the maintenance hangar. Black suits, white shirts, thin ties, and those unmistakable dark sunglasses that seemed standard issue for encounters that weren't supposed to happen. "Miss Walsh," the first man said, his voice carrying no trace of regional accent or personal warmth. "We need to discuss your shift activities." Janet's keys jangled in her trembling hand. "Who are you?" "We represent certain aviation security interests," the second man replied. "Your cooperation is required." They guided her, not roughly but with undeniable authority, to a black sedan parked in the visitor section. Janet noticed the car had no license plates, just empty frames that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside the vehicle, the men sat on either side of her while a third figure, hidden in shadow, occupied the driver's seat. The interior smelled of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong that made Janet's stomach churn. "Miss Walsh," the first man began, "you observed nothing unusual during your shift. Your radar functioned normally. You had no communications with March Air Force Base. But I did. You can check the recordings." The second man smiled, an expression so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the car. "Miss Walsh, what recordings?" "We've reviewed all communications from your facility tonight. There were no unusual contacts, no unidentified targets, no communications with military installations." Janet's blood ran cold. She knew those conversations had happened. She'd logged them in her personal notebook, written down exact times and details. But when she reached for her logbook, she found her jacket pocket empty. "Looking for this?" the first man asked, holding up her notebook. But it wasn't her notebook anymore. The pages she'd written on were blank, as if her careful documentation had never existed. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Miss Walsh," the shadowy driver spoke for the first time, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've been selected for a very special assignment. Your skills are valuable to certain projects that require absolute discretion." "What kind of assignment?" "You will continue your work at Riverside Municipal," the second man explained, "but you will also monitor for specific types of aircraft. When you detect them, you will not log their presence. You will not communicate with other facilities. You will simply note their passage and remain silent. And if I refuse..." The temperature in the car seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The first man leaned closer, and Janet noticed his breath didn't fog in the cold air. "Miss Walsh, you have a younger brother attending USC. David, isn't it? Studying aerospace engineering. Such a bright future ahead of him." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Janet's brother was her only family, her pride and joy. She'd worked double shifts to help pay his tuition, sacrificed everything to give him opportunities she'd never had. "We also understand your mother is in a care facility in San Diego," the second man added. "Lovely woman. Such a shame about the Alzheimer's. These facilities can be so expensive, and accidents do happen to patients who don't have adequate protection." Janet felt tears streaming down her face. "What do you want me to do?" The driver handed her a small electronic device, no bigger than a pager. "When this device activates, you will clear all aircraft from the specified airspace. You will log equipment malfunctions to explain any gaps in coverage. Most importantly, you will forget anything you observe during these periods. How will I explain clearing airspace without authorization? Miss Walsh, the first man said, you'll find that your supervisor will be very understanding. Your shift schedules will change. Your responsibilities will expand. Everything will seem perfectly normal to everyone except you. They drove her back to the airport parking lot in silence. As Janet climbed out of the car, the second man handed her a business card. It was completely blank except for a phone number printed in dark grey ink that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at it. Call this number if you have questions, he said. But remember, Miss Walsh, questions can be dangerous for people you care about. The black sedan pulled away without sound, its taillights disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness like dying stars. Janet stood alone in the parking lot, clutching the blank business card and the mysterious device. Knowing her life had just taken a turn into territory she didn't understand and couldn't escape. Over the following months, the device activated 17 times. Each activation meant clearing airspace for objects that officially didn't exist, objects that moved in ways no human technology could achieve. Janet watched them on her radar, tracked their impossible maneuvers, and logged nothing. Her supervisor, Tom Martinez, who had been a stickler for protocol and documentation for 12 years, suddenly became remarkably flexible about Janet's reports. Equipment malfunctions that should have triggered investigations were dismissed with a wave of his hand. Schedule changes that violated union agreements were approved without question. It was as if everyone around her was reading from a script she hadn't been given. The breaking point came 6 months later when Janet's brother, David, called her in panic. He'd been approached by 2 men in black suits who seemed to know intimate details about his life, his studies, even his girlfriend's name and address. They didn't threaten me directly, David told her over the phone, but they made it clear they were watching. They knew about my scholarship, my thesis project, even the coffee shop where I study. Janet, what's going on? What have you gotten involved with? That night, Janet stared at the blank business card for 3 hours before finally dialing the number. The phone rang once before a familiar voice answered. Miss Walsh, how can we help you? My brother. You said you'd leave him alone if I cooperated. Your brother contacted you about his visitors, didn't he? That wasn't part of our arrangement, Miss Walsh. David was supposed to remain unaware of our interest. Please, I've done everything you asked. I've kept silent, cleared airspace, filed false reports. What more do you want? Miss Walsh, your cooperation has been exemplary, but your brother's curiosity about his visitors represents a security concern. We need to ensure his continued discretion. Don't hurt him, please. Miss Walsh, we don't hurt people. We simply help them understand their place in larger systems they can't comprehend. Your brother will be fine, provided he learns the same lessons you have. The line went dead. Janet quit her job the next morning and moved to Montana, where she took work as a dispatcher for a small county sheriff's department. She never spoke of her experiences at Riverside Municipal, never looked up at aircraft passing overhead without wondering who was really controlling the skies. David completed his degree, but never pursued aerospace engineering. He became a high school math teacher instead, claiming he'd lost interest in aviation. When asked why, he would simply say that some dreams were too dangerous to follow. The files from Janet's time at Riverside Municipal Airport show no unusual activity during her employment. No unidentified aircraft, no cleared airspace, no equipment malfunctions. According to official records, it was one of the most routine and uneventful periods in the facility's history. But in a dusty box in Janet's Montana home, hidden beneath old photographs and tax returns, lies a small electronic device that hasn't activated in over 40 years. Sometimes, late at night when aircraft pass overhead, she takes it out and wonders if it's still connected to whatever system once controlled her life. The device remains silent, but Janet never stops watching the skies. The Blackwood family erasure, 1982, rural Montana. The Blackwood family disappeared on a Tuesday. Not physically. Their bodies remained. Their routines continued. Their voices still filled their modest farmhouse outside Billings. But everything that made them who they were, everything that connected them to the night they witnessed something impossible, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. It started 3 weeks earlier when 16-year-old Sarah Blackwood saw lights dancing over the wheat fields. Not the gentle glow of fireflies or the distant headlights of passing cars, but something else entirely. Geometric patterns of brilliant white light that moved with purpose across the Montana sky, stopping and starting in perfect formation before disappearing beyond the horizon. Sarah told her parents, Jim and Margaret, who initially dismissed it as teenagers' imagination running wild. But when the lights returned the following night, and the night after that, the entire family found themselves gathered on their front porch, watching in silent awe as unknown craft performed aerial ballets above their land. On the fourth night, Jim decided to document what they were seeing. He retrieved his old Polaroid camera and managed to capture 3 photographs before the lights suddenly vanished. The images were blurry but unmistakable. Solid objects reflecting moonlight, clearly artificial, clearly not from any earthly aviation program. The family spent hours examining the photographs, discussing what they'd witnessed, debating whether they should contact authorities. Margaret worried about ridicule. Sarah was excited about the possibility of contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. Jim, a pragmatic farmer who'd never believed in anything he couldn't touch, found his worldview crumbling with each unexplained sighting. They decided to wait, to observe, to gather more evidence before making any reports. It was a decision that would cost them everything. The men arrived on a Thursday morning while Jim was in town buying feed. Margaret was hanging laundry when she noticed the black sedan pulling into their driveway. 2 figures emerged, moving with that peculiar mechanical precision that would become sickeningly familiar. "Mrs. Blackwood," the first man said, removing his dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. "We need to discuss some photographs." Margaret's blood turned to ice. The Polaroids were hidden in Jim's desk drawer. No one knew about them except family members. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed. The second man smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humanity. "Mrs. Blackwood, please don't make this more difficult than necessary. We know about the photographs. We know about the lights. We know your family has been watching our operations." "Your operations? May we come inside? This conversation requires privacy." Something in their demeanor bypassed Margaret's conscious resistance. She found herself stepping aside, allowing these strangers into her home, into her sanctuary, into the space where her family felt safe. They settled in her kitchen with disturbing familiarity, as if they'd been there before. The first man placed a briefcase on her table and opened it with deliberate ceremony. Inside, perfectly organized, were copies of Jim's photographs. But they weren't Jim's photographs anymore. The images showed empty sky, dark fields, nothing but stars and moonlight. The craft that had been so clearly visible were gone, erased, as if they'd never existed. "Mrs. Blackwood," the second man said, his voice carrying an odd resonance that seemed to bypass her ears and speak directly to her brain. "These are the only photographs your husband took. Empty sky. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would interest anyone." Margaret stared at the altered images, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. But the lights were there. The craft. We all saw them. "Mrs. Blackwood, your family observed atmospheric phenomena, unusual cloud formations illuminated by moonlight, natural occurrences that might seem mysterious to untrained observers, but are perfectly explainable." "That's not what we saw." The first man leaned forward, and Margaret noticed his skin had an odd texture, almost artificial, like expensive prosthetics. "Mrs. Blackwood, what your family saw is what we tell you you saw. Nothing more, nothing less." They spent the next hour methodically dismantling every detail of the Blackwood family's experience. The lights became weather balloons. The formations became migrating birds. The impossible maneuvers became optical illusions caused by atmospheric distortion. With each explanation, Margaret felt something slipping away from her mind. Memories that had been crystal clear began to blur. Details that had been impossible to forget started fading like old photographs exposed to sunlight. "Where's my daughter?" Margaret asked suddenly, realizing Sarah should have been home from school. "Your daughter is at a friend's house," the second man replied. "She'll return this evening with no memory of unusual lights or strange aircraft. She'll remember spending time with her friends, studying for tests, engaging in normal teenage activities. You can't just change her memories." "Mrs. Blackwood, memory is far more fragile than most people realize, particularly memories of traumatic or extraordinary events. The mind naturally seeks rational explanations, normal patterns, comfortable interpretations of unusual experiences." Margaret tried to hold on to the truth, to remember the exact details of what they'd witnessed. But with each passing moment, the memories became less vivid, less certain, less real. When Jim returned home that evening, he found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, staring at photographs of empty sky. He couldn't understand why she seemed so confused, so disoriented. "What are these pictures of, honey?" he asked. Margaret looked up at him with empty eyes. "I don't remember taking them. They're just pictures of the sky. Nothing interesting." Sarah came home an hour later, chattering about her day at school, complaining about homework and teenage dramas. When Jim asked if she'd noticed anything unusual in the sky recently, she looked at him with genuine confusion. "Like what, Dad?" "It's just sky. Same as always." Over the following days, the Blackwood family continued their normal routines. Jim worked his fields, Margaret tended her garden, Sarah attended school and socialized with friends. They were the same people, living in the same house, following the same patterns. But something essential had been removed from their lives. Conversations that should have happened never occurred. Questions that should have been asked never formed in their minds. The extraordinary experience that should have bonded them together, should have given them shared wonder and excitement, simply didn't exist anymore. 3 weeks later, a researcher from the Mutual UFO Network contacted the Blackwood family about reports of unusual aerial activity in their area. Jim listened politely to the investigators' questions, but couldn't provide any useful information. "We haven't seen anything unusual," Jim said with complete honesty. "Just normal farm life out here. Quiet skies, nothing worth reporting." The investigator thanked him and moved on to other witnesses in the area. In his report, he noted that the Blackwood family seemed unusually detached and disinterested, as if they were reading from a script or had been coached on what to say. But the most disturbing detail was what the investigator noticed in Jim's study. On the desk, clearly visible, were 3 Polaroid photographs of empty sky. When asked about them, Jim seemed confused about why he'd bothered to photograph nothing but stars and darkness. "Must have been testing the camera," Jim said with a shrug. "Can't think of any other reason to take pictures of empty sky." The investigator left the Blackwood farm with a growing sense of unease. In 30 years of UFO research, he'd encountered many types of witnesses: believers and skeptics, truth-tellers and fabricators, people seeking attention, and people desperately wanting to be left alone. But he'd never encountered a family so thoroughly disconnected from an experience that had clearly happened. The empty photographs, the vague responses, the complete absence of curiosity about extraordinary events in their area. It all suggested something far more disturbing than simple skepticism or forgetfulness. It suggested intervention. The researcher made discreet inquiries in the Billings area, speaking with other farmers, local law enforcement, anyone who might have witnessed unusual activity. What he discovered was a pattern of missing time, forgotten experiences, and witnesses who seemed to have had crucial memories surgically removed. And in every case, the witnesses mentioned being visited by men in black suits who knew things they shouldn't know and had the ability to make inconvenient truths disappear. The Blackwood family still lives on their Montana farm. Jim still works the fields. Margaret still tends her garden. Sarah graduated and moved to Seattle, where she works as a software engineer. They're a normal, happy family, living normal, unremarkable lives. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are particularly bright, Jim finds himself standing on his front porch, staring up at the sky with a sense of profound loss he can't explain. Something important happened here once, something that should have changed everything. He just can't remember what it was. The Henderson Manufacturing Incident, 1978, Detroit, Michigan. The assembly line at Henderson Manufacturing had been running smoothly for 16 years when the impossible walked through the front door and turned everything into a carefully orchestrated lie. Marcus Williams had worked third-shift quality control since 1962, inspecting automotive parts in the vast warehouse that employed half his neighborhood. It was steady work, honest work, the kind of job that built Detroit's middle class and kept families fed through good times and bad. But on the night of March 22nd, 1978, Marcus witnessed something that would transform his understanding of how much control ordinary people really had over their own lives. The shift was winding down around 5 a.m. when Marcus noticed lights moving strangely outside the loading dock windows. At first he assumed it was an early delivery truck, maybe someone making an unscheduled pickup. But the lights were wrong, too bright, too uniform, moving in patterns that no earthly vehicle could manage. Marcus stepped outside for a better look and found himself staring at something that defied every assumption he'd made about the world. A metallic craft, roughly the size of a city bus, hovered silently 20 feet above the employee parking lot. Its surface reflected the orange sodium lights with perfect mirror precision, and it rotated slowly on its axis like a jewel turning in sunlight. Other workers had noticed too. 12 men and women from the night shift stood in the parking lot, necks craned upward, watching in stunned silence as the craft performed maneuvers that violated everything they thought they knew about physics and aviation. "Jesus Christ," whispered Tommy Kowalski, a press operator who'd served in Vietnam and thought he'd seen everything. "What the hell is that thing?" The craft descended slowly, stopping just above the chain-link fence that surrounded the facility. Marcus could see no windows, no visible propulsion system, no markings or identification. It simply existed, solid and undeniable, hanging in the air like a challenge to reality itself. For 7 minutes, the workers watched as the craft rotated and hovered, occasionally emitting brief flashes of brilliant white light that illuminated the entire parking area. Then, without warning or sound, it accelerated straight up and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving only the acrid smell of ozone and 12 witnesses whose lives were about to be systematically dismantled. Marcus was the first to break the spell. "Did everyone see that? We all saw that, right?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Tommy pulled out a pocket notebook and started writing down names, times, details. "We need to document this properly," he said. "Get statements from everyone while it's fresh in our minds." Within an hour, they had 12 signed statements describing identical observations: the craft's size, its movement patterns, the duration of the sighting, even the strange smell it left behind. Every detail matched across all witnesses. Marcus volunteered to contact local authorities. He'd served as union shop steward for 5 years and had experience dealing with management and outside agencies. If anyone could navigate the bureaucracy and ensure their report was taken seriously, it was him. He never got the chance. The men arrived at Henderson Manufacturing before the day shift began, 3 of them wearing identical black suits that seemed untouched by Detroit's industrial grit. They spoke briefly with plant manager Robert Chen, who immediately called an emergency meeting of all night shift personnel. Folks, Chen announced to the assembled workers, his voice strained and oddly formal. We need to discuss some confusion about last night's activities. It seems there was a misunderstanding about some equipment testing in the area. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Equipment testing. There had been no equipment, no testing, no explanation for what they'd witnessed except the impossible. The three men stood at the front of the room like judges presiding over a trial. The first man spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Last night, at approximately 4:57 a.m., several employees observed atmospheric testing equipment deployed by a classified government research program. The equipment was designed to evaluate air quality and electromagnetic conditions in industrial areas. That's not what we saw, Marcus interrupted. That thing was no weather balloon or testing equipment. It was a craft, solid and metallic, performing maneuvers that no human technology can achieve. The second man turned his attention to Marcus with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. Mr. Williams, you observed experimental atmospheric monitoring equipment. The unusual appearance was due to specialized reflective surfaces designed to gather environmental data. Bullshit, Tommy Kowalski said, rising from his chair. I know aircraft, conventional and experimental. That wasn't anything built by human hands. The third man smiled, an expression so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Mr. Kowalski, your military experience makes your testimony particularly valuable. Surely a trained observer like yourself can recognize advanced testing equipment when you see it. Something in the man's tone made Tommy step backward. The confidence that had carried him through combat in Southeast Asia suddenly evaporated, replaced by a primitive fear he couldn't name or understand. The equipment you observed, the first man continued, required the highest levels of security clearance to develop and deploy. Discussing its capabilities or appearance with unauthorized personnel would constitute a serious breach of national security. We're not military personnel, Marcus protested. We're factory workers. We don't have security clearances. Mr. Williams, you now have a security clearance by virtue of your accidental observation of classified equipment. This clearance comes with significant responsibilities and equally significant consequences for violations. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the day shift beginning their routines. 12 people who had shared an extraordinary experience found themselves isolated, threatened, and systematically cut off from their own memories. Over the next hour, the men in black suits interviewed each witness individually. Marcus watched his co-workers emerge from these private sessions, looking confused, disoriented, and strangely compliant. When his turn came, Marcus found himself in Chen's office facing all three men. Up close, he noticed details that made his skin crawl. Their faces seemed slightly wrong, as if constructed rather than born. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated, and their eyes, when they occasionally removed their dark glasses, were completely black, reflecting light like polished stone. Mr. Williams, the first man began, you're the informal leader of this group. Your cooperation will influence how your co-workers process this experience. What do you want from us? We want you to remember what you actually saw. Atmospheric monitoring equipment deployed for national security purposes. Equipment that appeared unusual due to its advanced design, but was entirely terrestrial in origin. And if we remember something different? The second man leaned forward, and Marcus caught a whiff of that same ozone smell that had lingered after the craft's departure. Mr. Williams, memory is remarkably malleable. Traumatic experiences, unusual sights, moments of high stress. They all create false memories, confabulations that seem real, but are actually the mind's attempt to process incomprehensible stimuli. Our memories aren't false. We all saw the same thing. Mr. Williams, 12 people can share the same hallucination, the same misperception, the same false interpretation of natural phenomena. Group psychology is a powerful force. What one person believes they see, others will believe they see as well. The third man opened a briefcase and removed a stack of documents. These are revised incident reports prepared by each of your co-workers. They accurately describe the atmospheric monitoring equipment you observed. Marcus scanned the reports with growing horror. Tommy's statement now described weather monitoring balloons with reflective surfaces. Sandra Morrison's account mentioned experimental air quality testing equipment that appeared unusual due to poor lighting conditions. Every witness had somehow revised their testimony to match the official explanation. They didn't write these, Marcus said. Mr. Williams, they absolutely wrote these. We simply helped them remember more clearly what they actually observed rather than what they thought they observed in the confusion of the moment. Marcus stared at the reports, trying to reconcile what he knew to be true with the evidence in front of him. His co-workers' handwriting was authentic. Their signatures matched the ones he'd seen thousands of times on union documents and time cards. But the content bore no resemblance to what they'd experienced together. Sign your report, Mr. Williams. Help your co-workers move past this confusion and return to their normal lives. Marcus looked at the document prepared in his name. It described witnessing routine testing of atmospheric monitoring equipment and concluded that the unusual appearance was due to unfamiliarity with advanced meteorological instruments. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to demand the truth, to protect the integrity of what he'd witnessed. But as he sat in that office, surrounded by beings who weren't quite human, holding documents that rewrote reality itself, Marcus realized he was facing forces far beyond his ability to resist. He signed the report. Over the following weeks, the night shift at Henderson Manufacturing returned to its normal routine. Workers arrived, performed their duties, went home to their families. The extraordinary event that should have bonded them together, should have given them shared purpose and excitement, simply ceased to exist in their collective memory. But Marcus noticed changes in his co-workers that troubled him deeply. Tommy Kowalski, who had always been curious and questioning, became oddly passive and incurious. Sandra Morrison, who loved discussing current events and scientific discoveries, showed no interest in news reports about unexplained aerial phenomena. It was as if crucial parts of their personalities had been carefully excised. Marcus himself felt the effects. He found it increasingly difficult to remember specific details about that night. The craft's exact appearance became fuzzy. The duration of the sighting grew uncertain. Even his emotional response to the experience began to fade, replaced by a vague sense that he'd witnessed something routine and explainable. 6 months later, a UFO researcher contacted Henderson Manufacturing about reports of unusual activity in the area. Marcus listened to the investigator's questions with genuine confusion. "I work nights," he told the researcher. "I'd notice if anything unusual happened. But we haven't seen anything out of the ordinary. Just normal factory operations, night after night." The researcher thanked him and moved on to other potential witnesses. In his notes, he recorded that Marcus Williams seemed unusually certain that nothing had happened, despite multiple anonymous tips suggesting otherwise. What the researcher didn't know was that Marcus's certainty was artificial, imposed rather than natural. Somewhere in the back of his mind, buried beneath layers of suggestion and manipulation, the truth still existed. Sometimes, in quiet moments between sleep and waking, Marcus would remember lights moving impossibly through the sky and feel a profound sense of loss. Something important had been stolen from him. Something that should have changed his understanding of the universe and his place within it. He just couldn't remember what it was. The Chester Valley Surveillance, 1985, Pennsylvania. The suburban streets of Chester Valley were lined with identical colonial houses, manicured lawns, and the comfortable predictability that defined American middle-class life in the mid-80s. For dental hygienist Carol Peterson, it was the perfect place to raise her two young children after her divorce. Quiet, safe, and blissfully ordinary. That illusion of safety shattered on a humid August evening when Carol discovered that ordinary was exactly what someone wanted her to believe. It started with small things. A black sedan parked across from her house that appeared whenever she returned from work. The same car, always with tinted windows, always occupied by figures she could never quite make out clearly. When she mentioned it to neighbors, they looked at her with polite confusion. What black sedan? They hadn't noticed anything unusual. Carol began keeping a log. Times, dates, duration of surveillance. The pattern became undeniable. The car appeared after significant events in her life. After she attended a UFO conference in Philadelphia. After she checked out books about unexplained phenomena from the local library. After she called her sister to discuss the strange lights she'd seen hovering over the Schuylkill River 3 weeks earlier. The lights themselves had been extraordinary. 7 brilliant orbs moving in perfect formation, stopping and starting with mechanical precision that defied conventional aircraft capabilities. Carol had watched them for nearly 30 minutes from her backyard, her children sleeping peacefully inside while something impossible danced across the Pennsylvania sky. She'd told no one initially. The divorce had been messy. Her ex-husband already questioned her stability, and she couldn't afford to give him ammunition for custody battles. But the experience haunted her. The lights had seemed aware of her observation, had even appeared to respond to her presence by altering their formation when she stepped outside. 2 weeks after the sighting, Carol made a mistake that would change everything. She called the UFO research hotline she'd seen advertised in a magazine, leaving her name and number along with a detailed description of what she'd witnessed. The black sedan appeared the next day. For 3 weeks, the surveillance continued. Always the same car, always positioned where Carol couldn't avoid seeing it. A constant reminder that someone was watching, evaluating, waiting for something. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Carol returned from her son's Little League game to find 2 men standing in her driveway. Black suits, white shirts, dark sunglasses despite the approaching sunset. They stood with that unnatural stillness she'd learned to associate with predators. "Mrs. Peterson," the first man said as she climbed out of her car, "we need to discuss your recent activities." Carol's children were still in the back seat, arguing over baseball cards and completely unaware of the danger. "Who are you?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "We represent certain research interests," the second man replied. "Your cooperation is required for national security purposes." "Kids, go inside," Carol said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Start your homework. I'll be in shortly." 8-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Sarah climbed out of the car, glancing curiously at the strange men before running toward the house. Carol waited until she heard the front door close before turning back to her uninvited visitors. "Mrs. Peterson, 3 weeks ago you observed atmospheric testing equipment deployed over the Schuylkill River," the first man began. "You subsequently contacted unauthorized research organizations to report this observation. I saw lights, unidentified aircraft. I had every right to report it." The second man smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humanity. "Mrs. Peterson, you observed classified military equipment being tested under controlled conditions. Your report to civilian organizations represents a potential security breach. Military equipment doesn't move like what I saw. Those lights violated every law of physics. Mrs. Peterson, advanced military technology often appears to violate physical laws to untrained observers. What you witnessed was entirely terrestrial in origin, developed at considerable expense for national defense purposes." Carol felt the familiar sensation of reality being rewritten around her. These men had perfected the art of making the impossible seem routine, the extraordinary seem mundane. "What do you want from me?" "We want you to understand the serious nature of what you observed," the first man said. "The equipment you witnessed is classified at the highest levels of government. Discussing its capabilities with unauthorized personnel could compromise ongoing defense programs. The second man opened a briefcase and removed a manila folder. Mrs. Peterson, we've prepared documentation that accurately describes your observation, military training exercises involving experimental aircraft with unusual lighting configurations. Carol looked at the papers with growing dread. Her own handwriting filled the pages, describing a routine military exercise she'd watched from her backyard. The impossible lights had become conventional aircraft. The gravity-defying maneuvers had become normal flight patterns viewed from a confusing angle. I didn't write this. Mrs. Peterson, you absolutely wrote this. We simply helped you remember more accurately what you actually observed rather than what you thought you observed in the excitement of the moment. The first man leaned closer, and Carol caught that distinctive ozone smell she'd noticed after the lights disappeared. Mrs. Peterson, you have two beautiful children. Michael excels at mathematics, doesn't he? And Sarah shows real artistic talent. Such bright futures ahead of them. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Carol's hands began to shake as she realized how thoroughly these men had researched her life, her family, her vulnerabilities. Your children attend Maple Grove Elementary, the second man continued. Wonderful school, safe neighborhood. It would be tragic if anything disrupted their education, their sense of security. Please, Carol whispered, they're just children. Mrs. Peterson, children are remarkably adaptable. They accept whatever reality their parents present to them. If their mother is calm and content, they remain calm and content. If she becomes agitated, confused, or unstable, they suffer accordingly. Carol understood. Her choice wasn't between truth and lies. It was between her children's safety and her own integrity. What happens now? The first man handed her a pen. You sign the corrected report. You acknowledge that your initial confusion was due to unfamiliarity with military aircraft and unusual viewing conditions. Most importantly, you cease all contact with UFO research organizations. Carol signed the document with trembling hands, watching her signature transform her extraordinary experience into routine military exercises. Mrs. Peterson, you've made an excellent decision. Your children will benefit from your wisdom. The men climbed into their black sedan and drove away without sound, leaving Carol standing in her driveway holding papers that rewrote her own memories. Over the following months, Carol found it increasingly difficult to remember specific details about that night. The lights became blurry in her recollection. The impossible maneuvers seemed less certain. Even her emotional response to the experience began to fade, replaced by vague embarrassment about mistaking military aircraft for something mysterious. But the surveillance never completely ended. Different cars now, different schedules, but always the subtle reminder that someone was watching. Carol learned to live with the constant awareness that her life was being monitored, her activities catalogued, her communications potentially intercepted. She never attended another UFO conference, never checked out books about unexplained phenomena, never called research hotlines or joined discussion groups. Her curiosity about the unknown was systematically extinguished through a campaign of subtle intimidation that left no fingerprints but achieved complete compliance. Years later, when her children were adults, Carol sometimes wondered what she might have discovered if she'd been braver, more persistent, less concerned about consequences. But those thoughts were always accompanied by the memory of two men in black suits who knew everything about her family and had the power to make inconvenient truths disappear. The Chester Valley incident was never officially recorded. No military exercises were documented in the area during that time period. No aircraft deployments matched Carol's original description, but in the files of certain government agencies, there exists a brief notation about successful containment of a potential security breach involving unauthorized civilian observation of classified phenomena. The notation includes Carol Peterson's name, address, and a single-word assessment. Neutralized. The Riverside County Library Encounter, 1981, California. Librarian Helen Martinez had always believed that knowledge belonged to everyone. In her 15 years managing the reference section at Riverside County's main library, she'd helped thousands of patrons find information on every conceivable topic. From genealogy research to technical manuals, from historical documents to contemporary science, Helen viewed herself as a guardian of humanity's collected wisdom. That philosophy would be tested in ways she never imagined when a simple research request opened a door into territories where knowledge carried a price measured in freedom itself. It started innocuously enough. A well-dressed man in his 40s approached Helen's desk on a quiet Thursday afternoon, requesting access to newspaper archives from 1947. Specifically, he wanted articles about unusual aircraft sightings in the Southwest during June and July of that year. Helen was accustomed to UFO researchers. They were frequent visitors to the library, usually earnest individuals pursuing personal interests or academic projects. She guided them to the microfilm collection and helped them navigate the indexing system with the same professional courtesy she extended to all patrons. This man was different. He moved through the archives with surgical precision, photographing specific articles with a compact camera that seemed far more sophisticated than typical consumer equipment. He took no notes, asked no questions, and seemed to know exactly which newspapers and dates would contain relevant information. What disturbed Helen most was his focus on witness testimonies that had been retracted or explained away in subsequent articles. He photographed the original accounts, but ignored the follow-up stories that provided conventional explanations for the sightings. After 3 hours of intensive research, the man approached Helen's desk with an unusual request. He wanted to know if the library maintained records of who accessed specific archival materials. Patron research logs, sign-in sheets, any documentation that might indicate who had previously examined the same newspaper collections. Helen explained the library's privacy policies. Patron records were confidential and couldn't be shared with unauthorized individuals. The man listened politely, thanked her for her assistance, and left without providing a name or contact information. Helen thought nothing more of the encounter until the next morning, when she discovered that 3 months' worth of microfilm from 1947 were missing from the archives. Not just misplaced or misfiled, but completely gone. The storage boxes remained, but the film reels themselves had vanished overnight. She reported the theft to library administration and local police. Security footage from the previous evening showed the library's interior after closing hours, but revealed nothing unusual. No forced entry, no signs of disturbance, no indication of how someone had gained access to the secured archives. The investigation stalled when police discovered that the missing materials weren't actually missing. According to the library's official inventory records, those specific microfilm reels had never existed. The cataloguing system showed no record of newspapers from June and July 1947 ever being archived at the Riverside County Library. Helen stared at the computerized records in disbelief. She'd personally helped dozens of researchers access those exact materials over the years. She remembered the headlines, the witness accounts, the follow-up stories, but according to every official database, those newspapers had never been part of the library's collection. Her supervisor, Margaret Wells, seemed genuinely confused by Helen's concerns. "Helen, I've worked here for 20 years. We've never had a complete collection of 1947 newspapers. Too expensive to maintain, not enough research interest to justify the storage space. Margaret, I've shown those microfilms to researchers dozens of times. The UFO sightings, the military explanations, the witness retractions. I know those materials existed." Margaret looked at Helen with the patient expression reserved for employees experiencing stress-related confusion. "Helen, maybe you're thinking of materials from other libraries. Or perhaps researchers brought their own microfilms for you to help them review." Memory can play tricks, especially when we're overworked. Helen wanted to argue, to insist on the truth of her recollections. But doubt began creeping in as she tried to recall specific details, Which newspapers exactly? Which dates? Which researchers had she helped? The memories that had seemed crystal clear that morning became increasingly fuzzy as the day progressed. That evening, Helen received a phone call at home. The voice was polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "Miss Martinez, this is Agent Reynolds with the Department of Information Security. We need to schedule a meeting regarding some materials that were accessed at your facility." "I'm sorry, what department? I've never heard of information security." "Miss Martinez, we handle situations involving unauthorized access to sensitive historical materials. Your cooperation is required for national security purposes." Helen felt her blood turn cold. The missing microfilms? But they weren't sensitive materials, just old newspapers. "Miss Martinez, the materials in question contained information that requires careful management to prevent public misunderstanding. We'll meet tomorrow at your library, after normal operating hours." The line went dead. Helen spent a sleepless night trying to understand what was happening. Newspapers from 1947 didn't seem like national security materials. UFO sightings from 34 years ago hardly qualified as sensitive intelligence. Yet someone with government authority was taking the situation seriously enough to demand a personal meeting. The next evening, two men waited for Helen outside the library's main entrance. Black suits, white shirts, dark sunglasses, despite the setting sun. They introduced themselves as Agent Reynolds and Agent Collins, displaying credentials that looked official but seemed somehow wrong, as if the letters and seals shifted slightly when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Miss Martinez, we appreciate your cooperation," Agent Reynolds said as they entered the library. "The situation you've encountered requires delicate handling." They guided Helen to her own office, settling themselves in chairs with disturbing familiarity. Agent Collins opened a briefcase and removed a stack of documents. "Miss Martinez, yesterday you assisted a researcher who accessed materials related to atmospheric phenomena from 1947. These materials contained information that could be misinterpreted by civilian populations unfamiliar with advanced military testing programs." "You mean the UFO sightings? Those were just newspaper articles about unexplained lights in the sky." Agent Reynolds leaned forward, and Helen noticed his skin had an odd texture, almost artificial. "Miss Martinez, the 1947 incidents involved classified military experiments with advanced aircraft designs. Public reports of these tests were deliberately misleading to protect operational security. But the witnesses described impossible maneuvers, craft that violated known physics. Miss Martinez, witness testimony is notoriously unreliable, especially regarding unfamiliar technology viewed under stressful conditions. What appeared impossible to civilian observers was actually cutting-edge military aviation achieving precisely the results it was designed to achieve." Agent Collins handed Helen a revised inventory record showing that the Riverside County Library had never possessed microfilm collections of newspapers from June and July 1947. Her signature appeared at the bottom, certifying the accuracy of the updated records. "I didn't sign this," Helen protested. "Miss Martinez, you absolutely signed this document. We're simply helping you remember the correct information about your library's actual holdings, rather than false memories created by exposure to unauthorized materials." Helen stared at her signature, trying to reconcile what she knew to be true with the evidence in front of her. The handwriting was definitely hers, but she had no memory of signing any such document. "Miss Martinez, the researcher who visited your library yesterday was engaged in unauthorized intelligence gathering. His activities could compromise ongoing national security operations if the information he collected were to be disseminated to hostile organizations." Hostile organizations? He seemed like an ordinary researcher. Agent Reynolds smiled, an expression so cold it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "Miss Martinez, hostile intelligence services often employ individuals who appear to be ordinary researchers. They gather seemingly harmless historical information that can be analyzed to reveal patterns and capabilities of current military programs. What do you want from me? We want you to understand the serious nature of information security, Agent Collins explained. Libraries like yours are repositories of knowledge that could be exploited by foreign agents or domestic extremist groups. Your cooperation in identifying potentially sensitive materials helps protect national interests. They spent the next hour systematically reviewing Helen's recollections of the previous day. The mysterious researcher became a foreign intelligence operative. The missing microfilms became materials that had never existed. Her memories of helping other UFO researchers became false recollections created by exposure to misinformation. Miss Martinez, you'll find that your understanding of these events becomes much clearer over time, Agent Reynolds said as they prepared to leave. Memory has a way of correcting itself when presented with accurate information. Helen watched them drive away in their silent black sedan, holding documents that transformed her professional experience into something she couldn't trust or verify. Over the following weeks, she found it increasingly difficult to remember specific details about any UFO-related research requests she'd handled over the years. The researchers she thought she remembered helping became vague impressions. The materials she was certain she'd accessed became uncertain recollections. Even her confidence in her own professional competence began to erode as she questioned the reliability of her memory. 6 months later, Helen received a commendation from the library administration for her exemplary service in maintaining information security protocols. The citation praised her vigilance in identifying and reporting potentially sensitive materials that could be misused by unauthorized researchers. Helen stared at the certificate, feeling a profound sense of loss she couldn't explain. Something important had been taken from her, some fundamental trust in the reliability of knowledge itself. She continued working at the library for another 12 years, helping researchers find information on countless topics. But she never again felt completely confident in her ability to distinguish between what was real and what someone wanted her to believe was real. The archives from 1947 remained absent from the library's collection. According to all official records, they had never existed at all. The Portland Businessman's Dilemma, 1979, Oregon. Success in commercial real estate required reading people accurately, and Richard Hawthorne had built his Portland firm on that fundamental skill. In 23 years of negotiations, partnerships, and deals, he'd learned to spot deception, recognize genuine intent, and navigate the complex dynamics of high-stakes business relationships. None of that experience prepared him for the morning two men walked into his office and systematically dismantled everything he thought he understood about power and control. It started 3 weeks earlier when Richard witnessed something that challenged his pragmatic worldview. Driving home from a late client meeting along Highway 26, he'd noticed unusual lights maneuvering over the Cascade foothills. Not aircraft lights, not searchlights, but something else entirely. Geometric formations of brilliant illumination that moved with purpose and precision no earthly technology could achieve. Richard was a practical man who dealt in concrete realities, property values, zoning regulations, construction costs. He didn't believe in UFOs or government conspiracies or anything that couldn't be measured, documented, and verified through reliable sources. But what he saw that night defied every rational explanation he could devise. The lights had performed maneuvers that violated basic principles of physics, stopping and starting without deceleration, making sharp turns that should have destroyed any conventional aircraft. For nearly 40 minutes, Richard had pulled over to watch as something impossible demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't exist. He'd told his wife Janet about the experience, describing it as curiosity rather than conviction. Something unusual in the sky, probably military testing of experimental aircraft. Nothing that required dramatic interpretations or exotic explanations. But Richard couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. The precision of the movements, the deliberate nature of the formations, the way the lights seemed to respond to his observation by altering their patterns when he stepped out of his car. Against his better judgment, Richard began researching similar sightings. He contacted the National UFO Reporting Center, spoke with investigators who specialized in unexplained aerial phenomena, even attended a conference in Seattle where researchers presented cases that defied conventional explanation. The more he learned, the more disturbed he became. Not by the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation, which he still considered unlikely, but by the consistent suppression that accompanied significant sightings, pattern of witness intimidation and evidence officers, military personnel, describing credible people, pilots, police encounters with advanced technology, only to be discredited, silenced, or worse. Government agencies that denied knowledge while simultaneously while refusing to investigate their claims. Richard's business escating evidence. Media organizations that ridiculed witnesses' instincts told him something important was being hidden, something that powerful interests wanted to keep from public scrutiny. The question was what and why, and how far those interests would go to maintain secrecy. He got his answer on a Tuesday morning when two men entered his office without appointment or announcement. His secretary, normally scrupulous about screening visitors, seemed to have forgotten they existed the moment they passed her desk. "Mr. Hawthorne," the first man said, settling into a chair with disturbing familiarity. "We need to discuss your recent activities." Richard looked up from his morning paperwork, immediately recognizing the type of men he was dealing with. Government agents of some kind, probably federal, carrying themselves with the quiet authority that came from wielding power without oversight. "I'm sorry, do we have an appointment? My secretary didn't mention any scheduled meetings." The second man smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humanity. "Mr. Hawthorne, we represent certain business interests that intersect with your recent research activities. Your cooperation is required for mutual benefit." "Research activities? I'm in commercial real estate, not research." The first man opened a briefcase and removed a manila folder. "Mr. Hawthorne, 3 weeks ago, you observed advanced military aircraft conducting classified testing exercises over the Cascade Range. You subsequently contacted unauthorized organizations to report this observation." Richard felt his stomach drop. They knew about the lights, about his calls to research groups, about his attendance at the Seattle conference. But how? He'd used discretion, spoken only to established organizations, never publicized his interest in the subject. "I saw unusual lights. I reported them to appropriate research organizations. That's not illegal." "Mr. Hawthorne, you observed classified military technology being evaluated under controlled conditions," the second man explained. "Your reports to civilian organizations could compromise ongoing defense programs worth billions of dollars. Military technology doesn't move like what I saw. Those lights violated every law of physics." The first man leaned forward, and Richard noticed his skin had an odd texture, almost artificial. "Mr. Hawthorne, advanced military technology often appears to violate physical laws to untrained observers. What you witnessed represents decades of research and development funded at the highest levels of government." Richard's business instincts screamed danger. These men were selling something, but not in any way he recognized or understood. Their explanations felt rehearsed, their authority seemed unlimited, and their knowledge of his private activities was impossibly comprehensive. "What do you want from me?" "We want you to understand the serious nature of what you observed," the second man replied. "The technology you witnessed is classified at levels that require absolute discretion from civilian observers." The first man handed Richard a document that made his blood run cold. It was a detailed analysis of his business operations, including client lists, financial projections, ongoing negotiations, and personal information about his family that no outside organization should possess. Mr. Hawthorne, you've built an impressive business based on discretion and reliability, the second man observed. Your clients trust you with sensitive information because they know you understand the value of confidentiality. How did you get this information? These are private business records. Mr. Hawthorne, information security is a complex field that intersects with many aspects of modern life. Business records, personal communications, financial transactions, all of these generate data that can be analyzed by organizations with appropriate authority. Richard stared at the document, recognizing details that should have been known only to him and his most trusted associates. Banking relationships, private negotiations, even personal conversations with his wife about their retirement plans. This is illegal surveillance. I'm calling my lawyer. The first man smiled, reaching over to gently press down Richard's hand as he reached for the phone. Mr. Hawthorne, your lawyer is Jonathan Myers of Myers, Patterson and Associates. Excellent attorney. He's currently handling the Henderson property acquisition for your firm. Such a complex transaction, so many regulatory requirements that could be interpreted various ways. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Richard's most important deal of the year, months of negotiations and planning, could be destroyed by hostile regulatory interpretation. What do you want? We want you to sign a corrected report describing your observation of military aircraft conducting routine training exercises, the second man explained. We want you to cease all contact with UFO research organizations. Most importantly, we want you to understand that some forms of curiosity carry serious consequences. Richard looked at the prepared statement that transformed his extraordinary experience into routine military exercises. His own handwriting filled the pages, describing conventional aircraft performing normal maneuvers under unusual lighting conditions. I didn't write this. Mr. Hawthorne, you absolutely wrote this. We're simply helping you remember more accurately what you actually observed rather than what you thought you observed in the excitement of the moment. The first man leaned back in his chair, studying Richard with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. Mr. Hawthorne, you're a successful businessman because you understand when to pursue opportunities and when to avoid risks. This situation represents a significant risk to everything you've built. Richard signed the document with shaking hands, watching his signature transform truth into acceptable fiction. His extraordinary experience became routine military exercises. His legitimate research became misguided civilian interference. His questions became answers he never wanted to know. The men gathered their materials and prepared to leave, but the second man paused at the door. Mr. Hawthorne, you've made an excellent business decision. Your firm will continue to prosper. Your family will remain safe, and your reputation will remain intact. All because you understood when to stop asking questions. After they left, Richard sat in his office for hours, staring at documents that rewrote his own experience. The lights he'd seen became conventional aircraft. The impossible maneuvers became optical illusions. His curiosity about the unknown became dangerous naivety that had nearly cost him everything. Over the following months, Richard found it increasingly difficult to remember specific details about that night. The lights became less vivid in his recollection. The precise movements seemed less certain. Even his emotional response to the experience faded, replaced by embarrassment about mistaking military exercises for something mysterious. His business continued to prosper. The Henderson property deal closed successfully. His family remained safe and happy. By every measure that mattered to a practical businessman, the encounter with the men in black had been resolved favorably, but Richard never again looked up at the night sky with wonder. Some part of him understood that curiosity about the unknown was a luxury he could no longer afford. Years later, when colleagues discussed unexplained phenomena or mysterious government activities, Richard would listen politely, but never contribute to the conversations. He'd learned that some subjects were off-limits for successful businessmen who wanted to keep their success. The Riverside County Public Library maintained no records of Richard's research activities. The UFO organizations he'd contacted had no documentation of his calls or conference attendance. According to every official database, Richard Hawthorne had never expressed interest in unexplained aerial phenomena. But in a locked drawer in his home office, Richard kept a single item that reminded him of what had been taken from him. A business card from the National UFO Reporting Center, creased and faded, evidence of questions he was no longer allowed to ask. The Clearwater Fishing Guide's warning, 1980, Minnesota. The lakes of northern Minnesota held secrets older than the logging camps and mining towns that dotted their shores. Guide Jake Nordstrom had spent 30 years navigating these waters, reading weather patterns and fish behavior with the intuitive skill that separated true outdoorsmen from weekend tourists. But nothing in his decades of wilderness experience prepared him for the night. He discovered that some secrets were protected by forces that made the wilderness itself seem tame and predictable. Jake was guiding a family of tourists on Clearwater Lake when the incident began. The Hendersons had driven up from Minneapolis, hoping to catch walleye and northern pike, while enjoying what their travel brochures promised would be pristine wilderness solitude. It was their last night at the remote cabin Jake maintained for extended fishing expeditions. The evening had been perfect, clear skies, calm water, and fish biting enthusiastically enough to satisfy even inexperienced anglers. The Henderson children, ages 10 and 12, had caught their first northern pike and were already planning return visits. Around 9:30, as twilight settled over the lake like a comfortable blanket, Jake noticed lights moving beneath the water. At first, he assumed they were reflections from the cabin windows, or perhaps the headlights of a distant vehicle. But the lights were too bright, too organized, and moving in patterns that had nothing to do with surface activity. "Mr. Nordstrom," 12-year-old Sarah Henderson called from the dock. "There's something glowing under our boat." Jake looked where she was pointing and felt his world tilt sideways. Clearly visible through the dark water were geometric formations of brilliant light, moving with mechanical precision along the lake bottom. The lights seemed to be attached to structures, solid objects navigating beneath the surface with purpose and intelligence. "Dad, come look at this," 10-year-old Michael shouted. "There are lights everywhere under the water." Tom Henderson joined his children on the dock, followed by his wife Linda and Jake himself. What they observed defied every assumption about what could exist in the depths of a Minnesota wilderness lake. Dozens of lights moved in coordinated formations across the lake bottom, some individually, others in groups that maintained perfect spacing and synchronization. The objects they were attached to were clearly artificial, smooth metallic surfaces that reflected the lights with mirror precision. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered. "Jake, what are we looking at?" Jake had no answer. In 30 years of guiding on these lakes, he'd never seen or heard of anything remotely similar. The lights moved too purposefully to be natural phenomena, too organized to be random, too advanced to be any kind of human technology he could identify. "Are they submarines?" Linda asked, her voice tight with concern for her children's safety. "Ma'am, there's no way to get submarines into these lakes. No connecting waterways big enough, no access roads that could handle that kind of equipment. These lakes are landlocked wilderness." The lights continued their underwater ballet for nearly an hour, while the Henderson family and Jake watched in stunned fascination. Some objects rose closer to the surface, revealing metallic hulls that seemed seamless and impossible. Others descended into the deepest parts of the lake, their lights growing dim but never disappearing entirely. "Should we call someone?" Tom asked. "The sheriff, the Coast Guard, somebody in authority." Jake considered the suggestion carefully. He knew Sheriff Kowalski personally, had guided him and his family on fishing trips for 15 years. But what would he report? Unidentified submersible objects in a landlocked wilderness lake. performing maneuvers that defied known technology. Let's wait until morning, Jake decided. Get some photographs if they come back. Document what we're seeing before we contact authorities. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. The next morning, Jake woke before dawn to find two men standing beside his truck in the cabin's gravel parking area. Black suits, white shirts, dark sunglasses despite the early hour. They stood with that unnatural stillness he would later learn to associate with predators waiting for prey to make a mistake. "Mr. Nordstrom," the first man said, as Jake emerged from the cabin, "we need to discuss last night's activities." Jake felt his stomach drop. No one knew about the lights except the Henderson family and himself. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. The cabin had no phone service, no radio communication, no way anyone could have monitored their activities. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "We represent certain environmental monitoring interests," the second man replied. "Your cooperation is required for ecological protection purposes." Behind Jake, he could hear the Henderson family beginning their morning routines. Coffee brewing, children arguing about breakfast, the comfortable sounds of a family vacation continuing normally, while something impossible unfolded in the parking area. Environmental monitoring? What does that have to do with anything? The first man opened a briefcase and removed a manila folder. "Mr. Nordstrom, last night you and your clients observed underwater testing equipment deployed by a classified environmental research program. The equipment was designed to evaluate water quality and aquatic ecosystem health. That's not what we saw. Those were solid objects, artificial craft moving with intelligence and purpose." The second man smiled, an expression so cold it seemed to freeze the morning air. "Mr. Nordstrom, underwater research equipment often appears unusual to civilian observers unfamiliar with advanced monitoring technology. What seemed artificial was actually sophisticated instrumentation gathering environmental data." Jake stared at these men, trying to understand how they could possibly know what had happened on a remote lake in the middle of the wilderness. "How do you know what we saw? We haven't reported anything to anyone." "Mr. Nordstrom, environmental monitoring programs require comprehensive surveillance to ensure public safety and scientific integrity. Your activities were observed and recorded as part of standard research protocols." The casual admission of surveillance chilled Jake more than any direct threat could have. They'd been watched, monitored, their private family fishing trip somehow subject to observation by forces with resources and authority he couldn't comprehend. The Henderson family saw the same things I did. "Are you planning to intimidate them too?" The first man leaned forward, and Jake caught a whiff of that distinctive ozone smell he'd noticed after electrical storms. "Mr. Nordstrom, the Henderson family observed underwater monitoring equipment during a routine environmental survey. They'll remember an interesting but perfectly explainable encounter with scientific research gear. And if they remember something different?" "Mr. Nordstrom, memory is remarkably malleable, especially regarding unusual experiences observed under stressful conditions. People naturally seek rational explanations for phenomena they don't understand. We simply help them find those explanations." The second man handed Jake a document that made his hands shake. It was a detailed analysis of his guiding business, including client lists, financial records, and personal information about regular customers that no outside organization should possess. "Mr. Nordstrom, you've built a successful business based on providing authentic wilderness experiences to urban families seeking escape from modern complications. Your reputation depends on clients trusting your judgment and expertise." Jake scanned the document, recognizing private details about customers who'd become friends over years of fishing trips. Their children's names, their professions, their personal struggles and triumphs shared during long days on the water. "This information is private. How did you get access to my business records?" "Mr. Nordstrom, information gathering is a routine aspect of environmental monitoring programs. Business activities that intersect with sensitive ecological areas require evaluation to ensure compatibility with research objectives." The first man removed another document from his briefcase. "Mr. Nordstrom, We've prepared a corrected report describing your observation of underwater environmental monitoring equipment. The report accurately explains what you and your clients witnessed. Jake looked at the statement with growing horror. His own handwriting described watching routine deployment of water quality testing equipment during a scheduled environmental survey conducted by authorized research personnel. I didn't write this. Mr. Nordstrom, you absolutely wrote this report. We're simply helping you remember more accurately what you actually observed, rather than what you thought you observed in the excitement of the moment. The second man stood up, brushing invisible dust from his suit. Mr. Nordstrom, your business depends on maintaining positive relationships with clients who trust your expertise. Families like the Hendersons return year after year because they believe you provide safe, authentic experiences. What happens to them? What? Mr. Nordstrom, the Henderson family will remember a fascinating encounter with environmental research equipment. They'll have stories to tell friends about the interesting scientific work being conducted to protect wilderness areas. Most importantly, they'll continue to trust guides like yourself, who help them understand what they observe. Jake signed the document with trembling hands, watching his signature transform an impossible experience into routine scientific activity. The underwater craft became monitoring equipment. The intelligent movements became automated data collection procedures. His questions became answers that satisfied without revealing anything important. After the men left in their silent black sedan, Jake returned to the cabin to find the Henderson family packing their gear and discussing their amazing vacation. But their conversation had changed in subtle, disturbing ways. "That was really something last night," Tom said as he loaded fishing tackle into his car. "I've never seen environmental monitoring equipment operating underwater before." "The lights were so pretty," Sarah added, "like Christmas decorations for the fish." "I'm going to research underwater environmental programs when we get home," Linda decided. "It's wonderful that scientists are working so hard to protect these beautiful lakes." Jake listened to their altered recollections with growing dread. The family that had shared an extraordinary experience with him now remembered something entirely different, something safe and explainable and ultimately forgettable. Over the following weeks, Jake found it increasingly difficult to remember specific details about that night. The lights became less vivid in his recollection. The impossible movements seemed less certain. Even his emotional response to the experience began to fade, replaced by vague satisfaction about witnessing important scientific research. But Jake noticed changes in himself that troubled him deeply. His enthusiasm for guiding began to wane. The wilderness that had once felt infinite and mysterious now seemed monitored and controlled. He started declining bookings, eventually closing his business entirely and moving to Duluth, where he took work at a hardware store. Years later, when former clients asked why he'd quit guiding, Jake would give practical explanations about aging, changing interests, wanting a less demanding lifestyle. But the real reason was simpler and more disturbing. He'd learned that even the deepest wilderness was under surveillance, and that curiosity about the unknown carried consequences he wasn't prepared to face. The Clearwater Lake incident was never officially documented. No environmental research programs were recorded in the area during that time period. No monitoring equipment deployments matched Jake's original observations. But in the files of certain agencies, there exists a brief notation about successful management of potential security concerns involving unauthorized civilian observation of sensitive underwater operations. The notation includes Jake Nordstrom's name and a single-word assessment: contained. As our journey through these shadows draws toward its end, one truth emerges with disturbing clarity. These encounters, scattered across decades and geography, share more than just mysterious visitors in dark suits. They reveal a system operating beyond public knowledge, beyond democratic oversight, beyond the comfortable assumptions we make about living in a free society. The witnesses we've met tonight: Dale Morrison, Janet Walsh, the Blackwood family, Marcus Williams, Carol Peterson, Helen Martinez, Richard Hawthorne, and Jake Nordstrom, represent ordinary Americans whose only crime was observing something they weren't supposed to see. Their experiences remind us that the price of curiosity about certain subjects isn't just ridicule or dismissal, but systematic erasure of memory, identity, and truth itself. What makes these cases particularly chilling isn't the supernatural elements or the high-tech surveillance, but the surgical precision with which human lives are altered to serve larger purposes. Witnesses don't simply disappear. They're transformed into perfect examples of why certain questions should never be asked. The men in black aren't monsters from another dimension. They're something perhaps more terrifying. Representatives of systems so advanced, so thoroughly integrated into our society, that they can rewrite reality itself without leaving fingerprints. They operate in the spaces between official acknowledgement and public awareness, wielding authority that exists only because we're never quite sure it doesn't. Tomorrow, when you wake from whatever dreams these stories may have inspired, remember that the most effective secrets aren't hidden in underground bunkers or classified documents. They're hidden in plain sight, protected by our own willingness to accept comfortable explanations rather than pursue uncomfortable truths. The real mystery isn't whether we're alone in the universe. It's how much control we've unknowingly surrendered to forces that prefer we never ask the question in the first place. These 11 encounters represent just the visible edge of something far larger, a shadow system that has learned to manage reality itself by managing the people who experience it. The most disturbing aspect isn't that these visits happen, but how thoroughly they succeed. Witnesses don't just stay quiet. They genuinely forget what they saw, replacing extraordinary experiences with mundane explanations that satisfy everyone, except the part of their mind that knows something important was stolen. Perhaps that's the real purpose of these encounters, not to silence witnesses, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance, to show that even our most private experiences, our most certain memories, our most fundamental sense of what's real, all of it can be revised by forces we can't see, can't fight, can't even properly identify. The next time you see something that doesn't fit, something that challenges official explanations, something that makes you question what you thought you knew about the world, remember these stories. Remember that curiosity about certain subjects comes with a price that's measured not in money or reputation, but in the integrity of your own mind. The men in black aren't legends or folklore. They're quality control for a reality management system that depends on our cooperation to function. Every time we choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable questions, every time we accept official explanations that don't quite fit, every time we dismiss witnesses as delusional rather than consider what they might have seen, we become part of the system that keeps these secrets buried. The truth isn't out there, waiting to be discovered. It's right here, walking among us in dark suits and polite smiles, carrying briefcases full of revised memories and alternative explanations. It speaks in measured tones about national security and public safety, about the danger of misunderstanding and the importance of maintaining social order. And somewhere in government files that officially don't exist, these 11 cases are marked with a single word that summarizes the ultimate goal of every encounter, every visit, every polite conversation that rewrites reality itself. Contained. The shadows are growing longer now, and sleep calls with promises of dreams that won't be monitored, memories that won't be revised, questions that won't carry consequences. But as you drift toward unconsciousness, carrying these stories with you into whatever visions the night may bring, remember that the most important truth isn't about flying saucers or alien visitors. It's about the careful, systematic way that wonder itself has been weaponized against us. The way our natural curiosity about the unknown has been transformed into a liability that must be managed rather than celebrated. The way asking the wrong questions can result in losing the ability to ask questions at all. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers in the shadows. May you wake tomorrow with your curiosity intact, your memories your own, and your questions still burning bright, despite all the forces that would prefer you never ask them. The universe is far stranger than they want you to know, and that strangeness is worth protecting, even if the price is eternal vigilance against those who would steal it from you one memory at a time. In the end, the men in black succeed not through force or intimidation, but through our willing participation in the erasure of wonder itself. Every time we choose comfort over truth, safety over curiosity, acceptance over investigation, we hand them another victory in a war most of us don't even realize is being fought. But knowing the war exists is the first step toward fighting back. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world seems full of infinite possibility, that knowledge is enough to keep the questions alive, burning like small flames in the darkness, that no amount of official explanation can quite extinguish. The stories end, but the mystery remains. And in that mystery lies the only freedom that truly matters. The freedom to wonder, to question, to seek truth regardless of the consequences. It's a dangerous freedom, as our 11 witnesses learned, but it's the only freedom that makes us human rather than simply managed. Sleep well and dream of truths they hope you'll never remember. The morning always comes, bringing with it the comfortable illusion that darkness and its revelations were merely dreams. But for those who've truly encountered the system that operates beyond public knowledge, dawn brings no relief from the understanding that reality itself is far more fragile than most dare to imagine. What we've explored tonight represents more than isolated incidents scattered across forgotten decades. These 11 encounters form a pattern, a methodology refined through generations of practice. The men in black aren't random agents responding to individual cases. They're part of something systematic, something that has learned to manage human consciousness itself with the precision of a well-tuned instrument. Consider the common elements threading through each story. The impossible knowledge of private details, the ability to alter official records retroactively, the surgical precision with which memories are revised, rather than simply erased. These aren't the crude tools of conventional intelligence operations. They represent something far more sophisticated, a technology of consciousness manipulation that operates at levels most neuroscientists would consider theoretical. The witnesses we've followed tonight shared one critical characteristic. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until they observed something extraordinary. None sought out unusual experiences. None had histories of instability or delusion. They were chosen not because of who they were, but because of what they saw and where they saw it. Dale Morrison's ranch sat directly beneath a flight path that officially didn't exist. Janet Walsh monitored airspace that someone needed to keep clear for operations that left no official footprint. The Blackwood family witnessed maneuvers over land that had been surveilled for purposes they were never meant to understand. Each encounter followed a precise protocol designed not just to silence witnesses, but to transform them into unwitting advertisements for the futility of curiosity itself. The psychological sophistication of these operations reveals planning that spans generations. The men in black don't simply threaten or intimidate. They offer witnesses a choice between comfortable lies and dangerous truths, then ensure the lies become more real than the original experiences. Memory, they understand, is not a recording device, but a reconstruction process. And reconstruction can be guided, shaped, edited to serve purposes the conscious mind never recognizes. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is their integration with legitimate institutions. Police departments that suddenly find their evidence has vanished. Libraries where historical records are retroactively edited. Hospitals where medical symptoms disappear from official charts. government agencies that deny knowledge while simultaneously confiscating materials. The system operates not in opposition to our institutions, but through them, using our trust in official authority to accomplish goals that could never be achieved through force alone. The technology implied by these encounters extends far beyond conventional surveillance. How do you monitor private conversations in remote locations without detectable equipment? How do you alter official records across multiple databases simultaneously? How do you ensure that witnesses' revised memories remain stable over decades? These capabilities suggest access to technologies that transcend current public knowledge, or perhaps technologies that have been deliberately kept from public knowledge for precisely these purposes. The witnesses themselves become involuntary experiments in consciousness control. Their altered memories, their changed behaviors, their systematic disconnection from their own experiences, all of it generates data about the malleability of human awareness. Each successful intervention refines the methodology, making future operations more precise, more effective, more invisible. But the most chilling aspect of this system isn't its technological sophistication or its institutional integration. It's the way it transforms victims into advocates for their own suppression. Witnesses don't just stay quiet about their experiences, they actively discourage others from investigating similar phenomena. They become walking advertisements for the wisdom of not asking certain questions, not pursuing certain lines of inquiry, not believing certain types of evidence. This psychological transformation serves multiple purposes. It discredits potential future witnesses by creating a community of former believers who now advocate skepticism. It demonstrates to other potential whistleblowers the futility of resistance. Most importantly, it maintains the system's invisibility by ensuring that even its victims never fully understand what happened to them. The geographic distribution of these encounters reveals another disturbing pattern. They occur in areas of strategic importance that have no official significance. Remote lakes that might conceal underwater facilities, agricultural areas that could serve as testing grounds, airports that handle traffic not recorded in civilian databases. The men in black appear wherever civilian populations might accidentally observe activities that officially don't exist. This suggests a parallel infrastructure operating alongside but separate from acknowledged government and military operations, facilities that don't appear on maps, programs that don't exist in budgets, personnel who carry credentials from agencies that have no public presence. It's a shadow system that has learned to hide not by operating in secret locations, but by operating in plain sight while ensuring witnesses can't trust their own observations. The temporal consistency of these encounters, spanning decades without apparent evolution in methodology, indicates institutional continuity that transcends normal governmental cycles. Political administrations change, military leadership rotates, intelligence agencies undergo periodic reorganization, but the men in black continue operating with identical procedures, identical authority, identical capabilities. This suggests either a level of bureaucratic entrenchment that exists beyond normal political oversight, or control by entities that aren't subject to conventional governmental constraints. The psychological profiles of effective agents reveal another disturbing element. The uncanny valley characteristics, movements that are too precise, responses that are too coordinated, expressions that seem manufactured rather than felt. These details, consistent across decades of witness testimony, suggest either extraordinary training programs that suppress normal human spontaneity, or the involvement of entities that aren't entirely human to begin with. The ultimate purpose of this system remains opaque, but its methods are becoming clear. It exists to maintain compartmentalization of knowledge, ensuring that certain technologies, certain capabilities, certain truths remain isolated from public awareness, not through crude suppression or violent intimidation, but through the elegant solution of making witnesses complicit in their own silence. Every successful intervention creates a model citizen, someone who has learned that curiosity about forbidden subjects leads to consequences too severe to risk, These reformed witnesses become unwitting agents of the system, discouraging investigation not through conscious deception, but through genuine belief that such investigations are dangerous, pointless, or delusional. The system's true genius lies in its sustainability. It doesn't require vast resources or constant monitoring because it transforms every encounter into a self-reinforcing lesson about the futility of resistance. Witnesses learn not just to stay quiet, but to want to stay quiet, to believe that silence serves their own best interests and the interests of everyone they care about. This creates a population that polices itself, that maintains the system's secrecy not through fear, but through conviction. A population that has learned to find comfort in not knowing, safety in not asking, peace in not remembering. A population perfectly adapted to living within carefully constructed boundaries of acceptable curiosity and permissible knowledge. The 11 encounters we've explored tonight represent the visible edge of something vast and invisible, a reality management system that has learned to hide not by avoiding detection, but by making detection irrelevant. When witnesses can't trust their own memories, when evidence disappears from official records, when rational people choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, the system achieves perfect invisibility by making truth itself suspect. As consciousness fades and sleep approaches, carrying these stories into whatever dreams the night may weave, remember that the most effective prison is one where the prisoners choose their own confinement. The men in black succeed not through force, but through the far more elegant solution of making their targets grateful for the chains. The darkness holds many secrets, but perhaps none more important than this: the systematic transformation of wonder into fear, curiosity into compliance, questions into silence. In that transformation lies the key to understanding not just these 11 encounters, but the broader architecture of a world where truth itself has become a carefully managed resource, distributed only to those with proper authorization and sufficient discretion. Sweet dreams, fellow seekers of forbidden knowledge. May you wake with your questions intact and your courage undiminished, despite all the forces arrayed against both. The universe is stranger than they permit you to know, and that strangeness is worth protecting. One dangerous question at a time. The silence that follows these revelations isn't the comfortable quiet of sleep approaching. It's the loaded stillness that comes when truth finally shows its face, unmasked and uncompromising. Tonight we've peeled back the veneer of normalcy to reveal something that operates in the spaces between official denial and public awareness. Something that has learned to hide by making hiding unnecessary. These 11 encounters aren't anomalies or isolated incidents. They're glimpses into a system so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of our society that it has become invisible through its very ubiquity. The men in black don't lurk in shadows because they've learned something far more effective. They walk among us in broad daylight, carrying briefcases full of revised realities and alternative truths that we accept because the alternative is admitting we have no control over our own memories. The men in black have achieved something remarkable. They've created a world where truth is whatever they say it is, where memory belongs to whoever has the power to edit it, and where the most dangerous act isn't violence or rebellion, but simply refusing to forget what you've seen. In that refusal lies the only real resistance any of us have left. Sleep well and dream of questions they hope you'll never remember to ask.